Hi, everybody. My name's Ed Falk, and I'm happy to bring Esme Voss here to speak for you. Esme got her start with Municipal Wireless shortly after the dot-com bust. She found herself looking for something to do, and she decided she'd educate herself about wireless. And she learned a lot, and then she decided she was going to blog about wireless. And then eventually she became the renowned expert on wireless. Excuse me. And today she runs a small business called MuniWireless.com. It employs about 8 people. It has its own magazine, and they organize conferences. And Esme travels around the world working on municipal wireless. And with no further ado, here's Esme.
Thanks, everyone. I didn't think anybody would be here because it's the Friday before the Memorial Day weekend, so I'm actually surprised there's anybody here. If this were in Europe, there'd definitely be nobody here. And I live in Amsterdam, and this is what we call the Hemelvaart weekend. That's the Christian holiday when Jesus supposedly went up to heaven bodily. So whether or not you believe it, but that's a big holiday weekend, and I'm glad there's actually people here. Thank you, Ed, for inviting me. I think this is of great interest to a lot of people, not just in Google, but in Mountain View and the Bay Area, in large part because San Francisco itself had recently issued a request for proposal and for someone to come and build, run, and maintain a citywide Wi-Fi network. Just as a matter of introduction, MuniWireless.com, I started it in June 2003, and my idea then had been that I was bored. I'm an intellectual property lawyer. My last job before this one was as the general counsel of Spray Network. That was a pan-European internet portal. We were on the road to an IPO in 2000 on 3 stock exchanges, NASDAQ, Amsterdam, the Stockholm Stock Exchange. And our valuation had been at $1 billion and then slowly crept down to like $550 million. And we had to sell the company to Lycos at the end of 2000. And so I started my own company. I was still a lawyer doing work for a lot of American software companies. And then 2003, there was nothing happening. So I started Muni Wireless because I was doing work for a company called Wi-Finder, which is the hotspot directory. And even at that time, I realized at some point that cities and regions were going to be carriers. A bit in the traditional sense of the word, a carrier, a telecommunications carrier. So I started seeing actually municipal wireless deployments pick up around 2004. And I don't know whether that has something to do with the fact that I had aggregated all this information. Because before I set up my website, which, by the way, the name came to me in the dream. I just woke up one day and spilled out of my head, and then I registered the domain name. But back in 2004, I started seeing this pickup in municipal deployments, and I don't know, as I say, whether it's something to do with aggregating all the information that, in fact, when you actually put together all the information about what different cities are doing, that people realize, hey, we can actually do them too. The problem I saw in June 2003 that inspired me to set up Muni Wireless was that if a city is thinking of doing a citywide Wi-Fi project, for example, San Francisco, where do they find the information on who's doing it, who the vendors are, how much it costs, and what the business models are? So that's what led basically to me setting up Muni Wireless. And at that point in time, I had no idea where it was going to go. I just knew that it was going to be something big, and I thought, well, if it doesn't work, I'll go do something else anyway. Today, I'd actually like to talk about 5 things that are very interesting to a lot of cities, to vendors, to partners. First, I'm going to discuss the current business models and the future business models that I see coming down. Then I'm going to talk about the players in the municipal wireless market. These are, not just the municipal governments, but the telcos are starting to get into this space. And I will move on to barriers to Muni deployments. As you all know, the incumbent telecoms and cable operators are not sitting still. They really don't like this happening, after all. And the differences between the US and Europe, I live in Amsterdam, and I've noticed that the deployments have taken off in the US, but really not so much in Europe, and there are many reasons for that, not just technological or regulatory. And finally, I will actually talk about ad-supported networks, in particular what a company called One-to-One Media is planning on doing. I had met the CEO of One-to-One Media few days ago, actually last week in London. The state of Muni Wireless, there are about 250 cities and counties in the United States that are actually running a network or have definite plans to set up a network. When I say definite plans, they've either put out an RFP, or they're about to put out an RFP, or they've already gone through a feasibility study, so they're definitely thinking about it. I don't think that there's a city today in the U.S. that's not at least thinking about it, where one of the city council members says, maybe we should set up a citywide Wi-Fi network. And the reason for that is that there are all these applications that they want to put on these networks that actually will save them money. The first thing, of course, they want to do is cut down their telecommunications costs. So any way you can get them to cancel the T1 lines and cancel their GPRS data subscriptions, that's a thing that they're looking for. And of course, they just want people to be a little bit more efficient. Instead of a building inspector going out to inspect the building and finding out that the developer had sent him the night before revised plans, now he has to go back to the office. This is very silly. What they'd like to do is to have people like that, anyone who goes out in a work order, anyone who inspects anything out in the field, to be able to just access that information from the field. And that can be a police officer that's checking federal, state, and local databases. That can also be somebody who's checking on the status of a project. So there are currently 60 live city and county-wide networks in the U.S. that have public access. By that I mean they offer some kind of internet access to their residents and businesses, whether it's free, paid, or a combination of both. There are 35 cities with giant hot zones, so these typically cover the downtown area or an area that has the convention center. 36 offer public safety or municipal apps only, so that means it's closed off to the public, but the city itself uses it for code inspectors or the police department. And there are about 100 or so with plans, where RFPs out and feasibility studies, and more come out every day. It's very difficult for me actually to keep on top of this market. There's so much going on. The business models. Currently, the business models fall into about 3 categories. One is the classic paid subscription model. This is where you pay, $20, $30 a month and you get access. That's been around for a while. The second kind of business model is the one that's been talked about lately, which is the free ad-supported model. This is what Metrify is doing, actually. Metrify, in case you don't know, it's an ISP that's based here. They have purport to have wireless service throughout the entire Santa Clara, Sunnyvale, and Cupertino. And they recently won the bids in Aurora, Illinois, Portland, actually, is their big win. And they're unwiring Foster City and Ontario, California, which is down near Pomona. Now, the founder of Metrify was one of the founders of Covad. So it's a person who knows a lot about networking and a lot about serving customers in the traditional ISP sense. Now, the last model, which has not been really discussed much in the press because not that many people use it, is the free model like they have in St. Cloud, Florida. This is a community of 28,000 people, whereby they justify the expense that they went through in building the network through the savings that they would get by having the city employees actually use that network intensively. So what happened to them is they actually they went through this ROI process, and they said, okay, let's see if we put all the cops on the network, so they're just around and they're patrolling and they spend more time on the street. We will cancel the T1 lines for the schools, and then calculate also how much money we save by canceling the T1 lines that we lease today. And so here are some figures for you. The police department, let's say, has 100 patrol cars. They figured that by canceling the GPRS, the slow GPRS data subscriptions that they have today for accessing databases, they would save on the order of $72,000 a year. The schools are 10 schools, so if they cancel their T1 lines, they were going to save $120,000. The savings for full-time employees because of the productivity. In other words, you don't need so many building inspectors going out anymore. And this is a town, by the way, that's growing quickly. It's in Florida, and because Orlando is very expensive, a lot of people are moving to St. Cloud. So they figured that the savings on productivity are on the order of like $900,000. So, a small growing city could save $1.3 million every year. And when you think about how much it really costs to build these networks, it's not that much. It's a wireless network. You don't have to dig. Many cities own their own fiber, so there's no backhaul cost either. The city typically donates the fiber to the operator of the network. And when it comes to wireless mesh nodes, they cost between $1,000 and $2,000 per node, but if you buy them in bulk, you can actually get the price down very low. And if your city does a sort of group buying deal with a company that provides wireless bridges like Peplink, they can get the price down to under $150. So for residents that actually need a wireless bridge in their houses to get the signal in the house, they have to buy a bridge, but because the city buys these in bulk, they can get the price down fairly low. So that's what they're doing in St. Cloud, where if you go there, everybody has just free wireless. There's no billing. There's none of that nonsense. They have hired Hewlett-Packard to deploy the network, to run it. And according to the consultant to that project, they had staffed up, Hewlett-Packard had staffed up their call center for the first month in which the network was in operation because they were expecting to get a lot of calls from people. Many of the people who live there are retired, and they're not really tech savvy. They have trouble, setting up their own home networks. But they were surprised that they had staffed up actually 3 to 5 times more than they had to. So it was fairly easy to get started. That's not to say that there aren't any glitches. There are a number of glitches, namely that there are some black spots and some people have trouble getting the signal in. But that's common for all wireless networks. I mean, when I go down to Capitola, there's lots of places down there where my cell phone doesn't even work, and that's not that far away from Silicon Valley. So it's just wireless. So we've got, the typical charge for access, the free ad-supported model, and then the free supported by municipal ROI model. The future business models. What I'm seeing right now is that a lot of cities are deploying networks based on automated meter reading. So Corpus Christi, Texas, which is a city in the Gulf that's very important for oil refining, they decided 2 years ago to replace all of the meters in the houses that are currently read today by a person. They go to every house and they read the meters. And they set up these wireless meters that talk to nodes on the street. And they decided, well, if we're going to set up an AMR project anyway, we might as well also offer wireless service to the residents, and then use it also for municipal purposes. So we're seeing now Corpus Christi, Texas, Burleson, Texas, a few other cities in the Midwest where there's actually a public utility that owns fiber and they want to replace the water meters. That is more or less the business model. They say, okay, if we set up this network, it saves so much money because we don't have to have all these people reading meters, and the meters will be read automatically and more efficiently, cuts down on fraud too. Then we can actually use this network and just offer free access. Why bother, putting in a billing system, which is very cumbersome? Why bother putting in, all kinds of subscription levels and having people go up and down trying to figure out what's happening? The other future business model I see, which is interesting because I think this will happen in Europe first before here, is what I call the virtual network operator model, whereby you have a company like Earthlink or perhaps even an operator like BT, British Telecom, simply wholesaling access to a company like Nintendo that has a following, because Nintendo and Sony have these gaming devices, portable devices that work on Wi-Fi. And Nintendo lately has actually been expanding their hotspot footprint, and I can see a company like that, say, buying access from cities, from Earthlink, from BT, from Verizon, and saying, look, we're just going to offer it as part of a package for our Nintendo users. They could charge for it, or maybe they can't. They can bake that into the price of the device. But it seems to me that groups that have, companies that have very strong following, like MySpace, Nintendo, Sony, and in the UK, there's a company called Carphone Warehouse that's even giving away very fast DSL service together with a voice over IP package. That those are the people who are actually going to be facing the customer in the future and not the telcos. The telcos are just going to run the dumb pipes. That's my prediction. Whenever I give this speech to a audience full of telcos, they sort of roll their eyes and tell me it's never going to happen. But in Europe, I'm starting to see it happen. So I think that'll happen in the United States, but at a later date. So now that we're talking about telcos and munis and service providers, I'll move on to who are the players in this market. Well, the first players in this market were really the small municipalities that had no broadband. It's all dial-up. In particular, there is a town called Scottsburg in Indiana, population 6,000, 29 miles from Louisville. What happened in that town is happening to a lot of towns in the United States. There is a big Chrysler dealership and a repair center there, right? And it employs a lot of people. There are also a lot of people in the town who do medical transcription from home. So they're home workers and then they're Chrysler workers. The town didn't have broadband until 2 years ago. And what happened was, today, you know, when you take your car in to a dealer, they hook it up to a computer. And what happens is that the mechanics actually get access to the database that is sitting somewhere in a server somewhere at the home office or whatever to figure out how to fix your car, to do things with your car. So that if you are a dealership and a repair shop in a place that only has dial-up, you can't do that. So Chrysler was about to decommission and decertify this particular dealership and their repair center. And that would have meant that the town would have lost all those jobs, and the medical transcribers themselves were handling more and more work. And the people who were sending them work said, well, you're in dial-up, you know, we can't keep giving you this work because we want you to do this, this, and this. And most of them would have moved to Louisville, so the mayor had a choice. He either had to, you know, bring broadband to this town or just close it down. So he went up to Verizon and said, hey, how about it? You know, why don't you set up a, you know, there's demand here. Why don't you set up a broadband network here and offer service to the resident? But it's a town with 6,000 people. They weren't interested. So the mayor went out and just decided he was going to set up a broadband network. So they got a company called Alvarian to deliver the equipment, and they hired someone who had been an ISP before to come into the town and set up a service provider, and that's what they did. And they saved the jobs, and the medical transcribers sat in the town, and they're still there. And they're doing very well. But this, you know, this story is just repeated everywhere now in the United States. But the sad part is that there's still 14 states in the U.S. that have some kind of restriction against towns setting up their own wired or wireless broadband network, which is very silly because it's precisely in those towns that the service providers like Verizon and AT&T don't want to go to. But these are also rules that were put into place by legislators who are friendly to these incumbents. So the whole thing is just completely screwed up. After the smaller towns started setting up these networks and getting them rolling, the ISP started getting interested because, of course, now the whole muni broadband thing is out of the hat. Everyone's looking into it. So the service providers, the traditional ISPs, are saying, hey, maybe there's something in it for us. And there are a number of cities, for example, and towns that don't want to be their own service provider. I mean, Scottsburg is very much of an exception. They had to do it because nobody else was going to do it. There wasn't any ISP in their town. So what's happening right now, actually, is that when you see an RFP for a network put out by a town or a city or now a county, they usually seek, you know, someone to just build it, run it, maintain it. They're not saying, oh, just set it up and don't worry, we're going to do it ourselves. That's very rare. So the RFP of San Francisco, Philadelphia, Portland are very typical examples of what we're seeing out there today. And so aside from MetroPhi here in Silicon Valley, there's a company called NeoReach, which is a subsidiary of Mobile Pro. They've set up a very large network in Tempe, Arizona. It's up and running. I think it's been up for 3 months now, and apparently it's going very well. There's a company also called US Wireless that's setting up. It's more in the Midwest and in the South, in Louisiana. And it's funny because once these people start actually going in and delivering service, and everyone sees, oh, they have subscribers. There are actually people signing up and using the network. Now, the people who used to oppose it, the telcos and the cable companies, are submitting responses to bids. So I've seen bid responses in different places from AT&T, from cable companies, from public utilities. For example, Toronto Hydro Telecom, which is the city-owned utility in Toronto, Canada, is deploying a citywide network there. And when I talked to the guy from Toronto, he said, well, it's just a normal extension of what they want to do with their service because they provide electricity, water, they have a telecom, so they provide telephone service. So why not wireless broadband? And what I'm seeing in Europe especially, not so much in the United States, but in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, The public utilities there have been responsible for building out fiber infrastructure, and what they do is they wholesale access to ISPs, so that they are basically the owner of the passive infrastructure, and they wholesale access. And it's part of their way of getting more revenue, because electricity, water, how much money can you get from that? But that's the next step for the public utilities. So you'll see more of that happening in the US and Canada. The regional telcos are also very interested. So Mishtel, which is a Michigan telecoms operator, is now doing a project in Oakland County, Michigan. So this is a county-wide project, very big. And you're wondering, oh, why would a county do this? Well, one of the problems with rural areas is that if you have little towns, each of them putting out RFPs, it's not very interesting for a service provider to come in and serve a town with 10,000 people, or a town over here at 15,000. So what the county does is basically it aggregates demand. It puts out an RFP for all of the cities and towns in their region, and it's something like a template agreement, right? So once the RFP is out, any town that wants to have wireless broadband service, for a service provider, they don't have to negotiate each and every single time with a town. They just use this template agreement, and it's a very good way of aggregating service. And that's actually how Swedish municipalities did it for their fiber optic service in the northern part of Sweden. They aggregated the demand. And that's how they actually brought fiber to the home in very rural areas in northern Sweden, which is sparsely populated. The incumbents are now getting into it. Recently, British Telecom announced that they were going to unwire 12 cities in the UK. They've signed deals now with 6 cities, the big ones, Leeds, Birmingham, Manchester. And it's really interesting because I spoke to the head of of the wireless broadband division of BT last week, and he told me that they have an interesting model. But when you look at Europe, it's very different from the States. When you look at Europe, broadband is very cheap. I mean, in the UK, a company I mentioned before, Carphone Warehouse, this is one of these, their traditional business model had been selling car phones. Little big bricks. And then they went into mobile phones, and it's a giant retailer, like a Best Buy. So Carphone Warehouse has this deal now where for £10 a month, you can get voice over IP service, and they throw in free broadband, 8 megabits per second down, 1 megabit per second up, just with this service. So as you can see, the broadband market in Europe is like DSL, it's very commodity. And there's so many competitors. In Amsterdam, there's probably 10 to 12 providers of DSL service, plus the cable people. So I asked this guy, oh, it's not interesting for you. Why should British Telecom do this? It's murderous, the competition. And he told me they view the wireless network as carrying 4 business models for them. The most lucrative for them is in the muni and enterprise business. So what they're going to do for these municipalities is the following. They're going to set up these networks for them, obviously, also for public access. But for the municipality, they will set up CCTV, these are the closed-circuit TV, police, public safety applications, parking and traffic control, transportation control, for the buses and the trains in that area, and also, of course, for the mobile office. And BT actually has a systems integration arm called BT Systems, which is a competitor of IBM on a lot of these different types of projects. So you can see where they're heading to already. It's in the high-value, high-level systems integration business. They also plan to help large enterprises. For example, in the City of London, they signed deals with the Borough of Westminster to set up a network there. And if you have a large enterprise and you say, hey, I want my employees to use this network for a variety of things, you just go up to BT and you have them set up your applications. That's one of the things they're selling with this network. Then, of course, there's voice over IP. British Telecom is one of the few giant telcos in Europe that no longer has a mobile operator subsidiary. Unlike Deutsche Telekom, which has T-Mobile, KPN in the Netherlands that has KPN Mobile, BT got rid of O2 years ago. That means that they are actively competing to get customers away from the mobile operators. And one of the things they're planning on doing, of course, is giving people cheap voice over IP handsets, right, that they can use on this network. Most people call people in their city, kids, parents, they just call locally. So why use a mobile operator when you just call within your, shall we call it, intranet? So now you've defined the intranet as just a wireless community intranet. The last one, of course, is public access. Now, BT still has DSL customers, right? So they plan to offer this as part of their service. And in a very competitive market, if you the more you can bundle things with, the more you can keep your customers or steal customers away from the competitor. So assume you have BT DSL service today, and they say to you tomorrow, hey, don't leave, don't go to Carphone Warehouse, because no matter where you go in the UK, all the major cities, we're there too. And it's wireless broadband, so you can access your email and the internet from anywhere using your own username and password. It's very appealing, as you can see, for many customers, especially people who travel a lot in the UK. Eventually, though, I believe, BT didn't say this, that eventually, I can see it coming, I believe that BT will just wholesale access to people like Nintendo, MySpace, Virgin, Carphone Warehouse, because those people have very strong customer followings. And it makes more sense for those people to deliver service to the customer instead of BT, because this thing has completely commoditized. So I can see them, for example, selling a package like they do today, actually, in the mobile phone world, the mobile virtual network operators selling a package of minutes, or in this case, bandwidth, to someone like MySpace or someone like Nintendo, and getting out of the customer market altogether. What's interesting about this whole discussion, of traditional business models, of paid subscription, the free and everything is, people say to me, how can you be behind free service? There's no such thing as a free lunch. And it's always the traditional ISPs that scream about this, There's no such thing as free. This is communism. You're promoting communism. And I have to say, look, anybody who's been on a train or a subway lately, at least I know in Amsterdam, they have these free newspapers. Have you seen them? They're like, when you're walking into the train station, they're piled up there. They're often called Metro. It's a Swedish company that has free daily newspaper. That's free. You just pick it up. Well, that's free, but it's paid for by advertising. TV. You turn on the TV, even if you don't have cable, one of the 3 networks. You watch a show, clearly, Desperate Housewives. That's not free in the sense of the word. Those people are paid a lot of money to act, to produce the show, to write the scripts. So I think what they're talking about is how can you promote completely new, different, innovative business models, and then they wrap it around this saran wrap of communism, which is just completely insane, because I've seen that on my website. I have a blog. People comment a lot, and I find myself taking down those comments very frequently. And when I look at the email addresses of the people commenting in that way, it's usually from traditional ISPs. So now we come to the barriers to Muni deployments, talking about traditional ISPs, and people have traditional business models. So the telcos and the traditional ISPs are all screaming, oh, there's this unfair advantage that munis have because they can get taxes from people and roll out these things, and it's all subsidized. What they fail to say, of course, is that the incumbents are heavily subsidized too, and that they just have this old business model that depends on this artificial scarcity. So what is the artificial scarcity? What they try to do, of course, is say to you that broadband is really scarce. Bandwidth is very scarce. So we have to charge you so much money per megabit of bandwidth. And when you look at the prices that people pay in the United States versus what people pay in Europe and in Asia on a megabit per second amount, it's really high, because over here in most cities and towns, there's only 2 providers. There's the cable guy, and then there's the telco. In a world like that, of course, there's only 2 people, they'll keep the prices high. In places where there are more competitors, the prices go down. So what a lot of these munis actually are trying to do, even in areas that do have cable and do have DSL, is to introduce a third player. That can be the municipality itself, or it can be the network commissioned by the municipality to be built and operated by a company like Earthlink, for example. And as soon as this third party is introduced, all of a sudden, there's competition. And if that third party is even required to wholesale access to other service providers, like Metrofy, maybe, or maybe Nintendo, all of a sudden you get competition. That is, in fact, what has happened already in the last 10 years in Europe on the wired broadband level. Because the incumbent operators were forced by the European Union to open up their networks to competitors on a wholesale basis at very low prices, you got more than 2 competitors in every market, and that's created competition. That is ultimately what the cities want to do, and that is also why the incumbent operators and the cable companies have been sending armies of lobbyists in various states like Texas, Nebraska, Indiana, and also on the federal level today to try to put in legislation that prohibits municipalities from rolling out municipal wired or wireless broadband networks. I'll give you an example actually, to backtrack, there are about 14 states today that have some kind of restriction on municipal broadband. And these were laws that were passed before 2005. Starting 2005 up until 2006, a number of states had proposals introduced in the state legislature, but surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, all except Nebraska were defeated. Why is that? Because by 2005, people were very conscious about this subject. People were tracking them. In Texas, for example, there was a huge battle. A state senator named Pete Sessions had introduced a very restrictive law prohibiting Texas municipalities from rolling out wireless and wired broadband networks. And the coalition that came together to defeat this particular measure was amazing. It was, wireless activists from Austin, tech companies in Austin like Dell. Apparently, I heard Michael Dell even placed a personal phone call to the legislature, to Pete Sessions, saying, you better not pass that. I personally was emailed by a very wealthy, very conservative Latin American or Mexican-American businessman near Laredo, Texas, who said to me that he was personally going to go down on the hearing day itself and actually tell this Pete Sessions that if this bill passed, that the Republicans who backed it would never get money anymore from the Republican Party. I mean, he was so mad about the whole thing. And it's just an amazing coalition of people from very conservative, wealthy Republican donors to sort of Austin wireless activists that got together and defeated it. The same thing happened in Indiana. There was a bill that was proposed there, and all these mayors, like this mayor from Scottsburg, they got into buses and they went to the state legislature and just basically said, don't you dare pass this because it's just terrible for everybody. So it's now very difficult to get that sort of thing passed, but still there are 14 states in the US. So now the battle has gone to Congress because, as you know, they are rewriting the Telecom Act of 1996, so that's where the battle is taken, and wrapped into the whole thing is the thing about net neutrality, about municipal access, about franchising and all that. So this is not over yet, and I suspect that the incumbents will do everything they can to try and stop true competition from coming into their markets. So what's the difference between the US and Europe in this matter, and why is it that Muni Wireless has taken off in the United States and not really that much in Europe? Well, the first thing, of course, is just competition. There's just so much competition on the wired broadband level in Europe, prices have dropped, that municipalities are sort of shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, why should I worry about that? We're already paying, 15 euros per month for really fast broadband, and, I can't be bothered about that. The other thing is that the regulations in the EU, at least, are quite strict. On the issue of municipalities spending public money for infrastructure like broadband. One of the things that they're really paranoid about is the following, and this has happened before. France, for example. Today there are rules against state subsidies to companies like France Telecom, right? So what France used to do is they do this indirect subsidy business. They would spend public money to build a broadband infrastructure, and then they would say, oh yeah, but only France Telecom can use it. So it's an indirect subsidy. So the EU said, okay, we're going to put a stop to that. From now on, if you're a municipality and you want to actually spend public money on telecommunications infrastructure, one, you have to do it if there's nothing there yet. So, for example, in a region like Catalonia, they're spending 500 million euros to set up a fiber network. Not fiber to the home, but fiber to various municipalities, fiber. And the other rule is that if you're going to spend public money, you have to open up that network to all competitors of your local incumbent. The local incumbent clearly can buy access, but you have to open it up to, maybe France Telecom and Deutsche Telekom and KPN and all that. And that way, they stop these countries from giving indirect subsidies to their telecom operators. So that's another reason why it's been easier in the States to get these things done than in Europe. The other thing is the power regulations in Europe. When you look at the amount of maximum radiated power that you're allowed to emit from these wireless mesh nodes, which are what we're going to hang on the light poles, right, and buildings in order to get wireless coverage. In Europe, the maximum radiated power is 100 milliwatts. In the States, it's about 7 to 8 times higher. It's really the maximum is 1,000 milliwatts, but no one really gets there. So as you can see, in Europe, if you want to set up a wireless network, you have to hang many, many more nodes, and in some cases, that will destroy the economics of the deployment. Plus, it's very difficult to get city permission to hang these things. It makes the buildings look ugly if you have all these nodes sticking up somewhere. So it's just very difficult to set it up in Europe. The other reason why wireless broadband, citywide Wi-Fi hasn't caught on is really a cultural thing, and I think this is something people miss. The cafe culture in Europe is so different from the one here. When you go to San Francisco, you see lots of people sitting in cafes with laptops, everyone just working there with their laptops. When you go to Amsterdam, it is very rare to see people working on their laptops. Why is that? Because people go to cafes not to work. People go there to socialize. So you typically go there either to meet someone, you've made an appointment to meet someone, or you go there with the purpose of, people watching or hopefully meeting someone. Now, the interesting thing is that over the last year, I've seen more and more people using laptops in Europe, but they're mostly Americans traveling, or younger Europeans who don't see laptops as sort of working. But if you go to a cafe today and you open your laptop and everyone around you is just socializing, people look at you like, why is this person actually working? And everyone's drinking beer, watching the football game, and you're working. It feels weird. So the actual use of public Wi-Fi in Europe is much, much lower than here. And so people don't think about, oh, gee, wouldn't it be nice to have a giant citywide network somewhere? So I think it's cultural, but again, it's catching up. And people are really more mobile phone centric over there. So again, that has something to do with the fact that mobile phone service there is very, very cheap. There's a lot of competition. There's roaming everywhere. So if you go to Spain, you'll get access there. And the whole thing's just so much better developed than in the United States. People there are very GSM-centric and not laptop-centric. And finally, advertising. So here's what's interesting. With advertising, all the paranoia in San Francisco about advertising, supported networks, about how people are, Google's just going to snoop on everybody and find out everything about your life and suddenly throw you ads for hemorrhoid cream or something like that. Very unpleasant. So I spoke to a company called One-to-One Media. It's a New York-based company that I believe is publicly traded. And this is interesting. What they're going to do, actually, One-to-One Media, is they want to work with ISPs, right? So let's say I'm an ISP. One-to-One comes to me and says, hey, you know what? We can share revenue with you. We'll split 50-50, all the revenue from advertising. And this is what they do. So, say I'm the ISP, and my customers will click, they'll look the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and actually what they do is they put a cookie on every a JavaScript small piece there at the end of every page you visit. So they track you, not you the person, but you a person sitting in a particular area of the city, and they track you looking at all these different sites. So let's say an advertiser like BMW goes up to One-to-One Media and says, we want you to show an ad to a person who visits the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and any one of these car companies' websites, Volvo, Audi, Mercedes. And what happens is one of two things. You either get a small ad that just pops up at the bottom of your screen here, like a little bar that goes up like this. It's fairly innocuous. You don't even really see it, but it's there, and you sort of see it like this for BMW. Or they do it like the New York Times, where you click on an article and then you get this blank page with an advertisement, and then there's a link here that says go to the article. So they have one of those two things. There's also an opt-out mechanism. So actually the ISP has a lot of control. What the ISP can do if it does not want to bother its customers too much is say, for example, oh, we have this deal with One-to-One Media. Do you want to opt out now? Or you can opt out when the ad is shown to you. so that you're never bothered again by advertising. And what they're trying to do actually is try to get profiles of users so that they can sell it to advertisers, or advertisers can say, look, we want you to show our ad for, let's say, shampoo to people who visit the following website. So they could say people who visit New York Style magazine, people who visit Estee Lauder or cosmetic company sites, or people who visit style.com. So that, and what happens is that it's more like a behavior typing, so that you and someone else who visit the same website will actually see different ads because you've been visiting other different websites. And that is a little bit more targeted than what we have today, where we see, on the site, the Google ads. Of course, it can be narrowed down to country. There's certain places where you would never see an ad, but if you're in the United States and that page is shown to you, you would see that ad. But this really goes down to your actual behavior, like what websites are you visiting? And one-to-one media is very careful about the privacy side because they're going to start operations in Europe. And as you know, the European regulations on data protection and on privacy are very, very strict. You cannot collect private information that identifies a person, my name, my social security number, my address, unless you protect it you don't send it to the advertiser. So they have a mechanism where they really do try to protect the person's identity, so that it's only a profile. A person maybe sitting in this area, if you have a citywide network, where the nodes can triangulate where you are, a person visiting these particular websites, please show this particular ad. So that is what they're planning on doing, and what I heard is that they are busy making deals with a lot of ISPs around the country. So, and I will open up the field to questions since we have 15 minutes. If you have any questions. Yes?
So you were talking earlier about how maybe Nintendo would buy a block of wireless bandwidth or something like that, and then how they would run it and just get the service provided by whoever was providing the bandwidth. It seems like, I don't know, right now I have Comcast cable, and I can barely get them to respond to anything when it goes down. How would Nintendo not screw over the user?
Okay, the question is, how would Nintendo, if Nintendo were to buy access from a telecom operator, for example, actually provide this service? Actually, the service will be provided by the original operator. They are running the network. They're responsible for making sure that there is coverage in that area. And Nintendo, what they'll do is they will simply say to the operator, look, we want to buy, we'll pay you this amount of money every year, or every month for this amount of bandwidth. We have 300,000 users, and you will allow our users to have to use their username and their password on, let's say, a Nintendo screen. So let's assume for the minute that you're in London and British Telecom has this deal with Nintendo. Open your laptop and you're in a city provided wireless access by British Telecom. They'll have perhaps a list of partners on the right side, and Nintendo will be one of them. You click on Nintendo, and you come up with a screen with Nintendo's logo and their username, and then a little box with the username and password, and you type it in, and there you go. So ultimately, Nintendo isn't actually responsible for the service. It is ultimately British Telecom. And why that would work better than Comcast? Because today, British Telecom has to serve all these customers, right? Millions and millions of people. But assume for the moment that British Telecom got out of the business of retail. They didn't have to serve millions of people anymore in that fashion, billing them directly, having a customer service center, dealing with people who cancel service and everything. Why, I think they could use that money, or perhaps, cut down their staff a little more and focus it more on delivering access to all these different groups of people through Nintendo instead of having a billing relationship with the end user. It's actually Nintendo that has a billing relationship with you. And that you can actually see that today in the mobile market. So there's a company called Easy Mobile in the UK, and of course, Virgin Mobile. All they do is they buy buckets of minutes, right, from another operator called T-Mobile. And they themselves do not run that network. Yes?
What's the total cost of deploying one of these Wi-Fi networks based on a certain size? And how is in terms of total number of dollars for the initial rollout and to keep it operational? What sort of budgets are we talking about?
Okay, the estimate, let me see. I just saw one this morning, actually. St. Paul, Minnesota, had done a feasibility study where they estimated that the cost of building a wireless network over St. Paul is about $7 to $10 million, just the cost of building the network. And then if they were to run it over a 20-year period, the total cost over that 20-year period, that includes the $10 million, and that includes the actual maintenance, would be between $21 million and $27 million. And they estimated that they could actually break even at the end of year 3 if they sold subscriptions for at least $20 a month to 15% of the potential subscriber base. So when you look at that cost, right, and you look at, let's say, building a fiber to the premises network in St. Paul, the fiber to the premises network would cost $296 million, and they would have to write it off over a period of 30 years or more. But of course, they could put more applications on it, more services like video, voice, and very high bandwidth applications that have nothing to do with the internet, but really for other purposes for the enterprise and municipality. So those are the costs we're looking at. As you can see, they're not trivial, which is why cities like to, outsource the building of these networks to private providers. Questions? Yes.
Is it any easier to deploy these municipal Wi-Fi networks in smaller cities where it might be a little harder, or harder for the large telecoms or the larger incumbent carriers to wield political influence over the long term over the local politicians?
So the question is it easier to set up these citywide Wi-Fi networks in smaller towns where it's more difficult for the incumbent operators to wield the amount of political power and to wheel and deal, obviously, with the local politicians? The answer is yes, it's much easier in a small town, first of all, because there's very little politics. Usually we're talking about a city council with 5 people on it, all of whom have known each other probably forever. The second, it's just not very interesting. I'll give you an example. St. Cloud in Florida. It's a town with 28,000 people. Okay, it's growing quickly, but it's a town of 28,000 people. I mean, how many, why would SBC spend all their time screaming about that? And in fact, what's very interesting about St. Cloud is that you have to ask yourself, maybe it's not necessarily worth it for SBC to go in there because the town did their homework. What they did is before they launched their network, they held so many community discussions about this network. They wanted to find out what people thought about it, what they wanted from it. They addressed the health concerns, for example, something that's not done in very big cities for very obvious reasons. Doing this in a city with 1 million people is just hairy. I mean, how many city meetings do you need to have? The second thing is that in a city like St. Cloud, there aren't that many factions. In San Francisco, there are so many small groups, with their own ideas on how to do things. There's people who are worried about getting cancer, because there's all these wireless signals. There's all these people who also think, well, we really should have a city-owned network, or we should have fiber and not wireless. And when you have a smaller town like that, there's just not many things to fight about. And so it's much easier. And yes, SBC is just not interested. Yes.
What about 3G? What about the competition with 3G?
The question is, what about the competition with 3G? That's a very good question, because 3 weeks ago in Amsterdam, or in the Netherlands, T-Mobile launched their supposedly wonderful 3G, it's like an EVDO service, right? So they're charging something on the order of, like 60 euros a month. And when you read their advertisement online, it's all like this. We provide you up to 1.8 megabits per second of super fast internet service, and it's just like the stuff you're used to in your house and in your office. Now, I don't know about the people who work at T-Mobile, but I can assure you that hardly anyone today, at least in places in the Netherlands where people like that would buy this service, they definitely get more than 1.8 megabit per second, right? So it's expensive. The carriers in Europe have been trying to do this for years. It's not working. Why? Because the capacity is really limited. I posted on my website a PowerPoint slide from Qualcomm. You know how they have this media flow thing? It actually, from Qualcomm, and it talked about how South Korea Telecom had launched some kind of EVDO service, like unlimited, right? So it's like, oh, you pay, $30 a month and just all you can eat, just use as much bandwidth. It didn't work. The network died. They had serious problems delivering the bandwidth to all of these people who wanted to use it for all of these things that people normally use broadband for in South Korea. So what they had to do basically is they couldn't give people unlimited access, just one fee and you just eat all you can eat. You have to meter people. And that is just death. People don't like to be metered. Why? Because, you know how they meter you? It's like, oh, okay, pay $30 a month, but if you use over a certain number of megabits, you send and receive. Well, how do you know how many megabits are in that photo you just sent to your friend? What about that little film that you just downloaded from your other friend? I mean, humans don't go around calculating the number of megabits that they're consuming on a phone. It is very unpopular, and I don't see it happening anywhere. It will be popular for a few people. Some people will buy it, but honestly, I don't see it working. And I think they know that, which is why they're all scrambling now, trying to find something to do in citywide Wi-Fi, and especially now that the Wi-Fi GSM phones are coming, they'll have to find something to do. Yes?
That begs the question of what happens to voice revenues for all these.
Oh, voice revenues? I'll give you an example. KPN Telecom, which is our incumbent operator, they're losing 10,000 landline customers a month. They all go to mobile, but mobile voice, and most of the subscriptions are not postpaid, they're prepaid. So people run around, they just pick whichever is cheaper. So maybe, the 6 months you use T-Mobile, next 6 months I use Orange, and that's...
Do you see VoIP over Wi-Fi?
Yes.
Killing the...
Completely. In fact, I'll leave you with this one. Time Warner Cable, right? I have a conference in Santa Clara from June 19 to 21, and one of the speakers is from Time Warner Cable. Time Warner Cable right now is actively looking for a city to unwire. And they want a city where people live, work, and play. And one of their ideas is to give people these cheap voice over IP handsets that they can use anywhere in the city to call their friends, to call relatives, whatever. They can just walk around in the city network to bundle that with their service. See, the key today is these people are so desperate to retain their customers, right? The price of marketing, of getting an additional customer is so high. They'll do anything to keep you. And that's one of those things, Voice is just sort of something you throw around like this. And so is, in Europe, apparently, broadband, car phone warehouse. So thank you, everyone. It's 3 o'clock. Thanks for coming.